Overtime School of Wrestling, High Performance Training, Peaking and Tapering by Coach Shannon as a part of the Coaches Education Seminars from the Overtime School of Wrestling in Naperville, Illinois, USA. Where does peaking and tapering come from? Peaking and tapering come from his past experiences, education, relevant research, trade journals, and books. My experiences come from being an athlete at the United States Olympic Education Center for 2 years and being a coach at the United States Olympic Education Center for 8 years. So in those 10 years, I was able to gather all of my experiences, the education I got from traveling around the world, the research that I gained from the United States Olympic Committee, and the trade and journal books that I've read and researched throughout the libraries and the internet across the world and nation. What is a taper? What I want you to focus on here is the green words in bold. Of course, you can read the whole definition there, but what is important is reducing stress to optimize performance and to enhance training adaptations. What a taper does, in essence, is reduce the amount of training that occurs by reducing the volume, at the same time increasing the intensity. Studies have shown that if you train less and keep the intensity high, the body's physiological and psychological response goes up, which means it is easier to train and it is easier to have high performance training and or results through competitions. The next several slides here are going to be research that's been done by sports scientists across the world, and it will indicate and or show you how and why the taper is effective and can help you to peak. Psychological indices of the effects of the taper. In this slide, you'll see the arrows pointing down, and those are, for the most part, things that are bad going on in the body. If those bad things go down, it's much easier to train, and the arrows that are pointing up indicate things that are good. And when those things go up, it's much easier to train and compete. Perception of effort. If the perception of effort actually goes down while you're training, it feels like you're not really doing anything, and so, of course, it's a lot easier to train. Global mood disturbances. If you are in a bad mood and that goes down, all of a sudden it feels like you're in a good mood and it's much easier to train. Perception of fatigue. Again, if it doesn't feel like you're tired while you're training, of course you can continue to train. If you have increased vigor, which means you're invigorated and or you're stimulated, if that goes up because of the taper, now you can, you're in a much better psychological state to train. Quality of sleep. If the quality of sleep actually feels like it's going up, you feel like you're more rested, you feel like you're more recovered, and that means, of course, you'll be able to train more. Again, this is all research done which indicates all of these psychological factors are increased or decreased, which is going to have a vast effect on high performance training. Next slide is biological indices of the effects of the taper. This is essentially a lot of physiological responses that go on in your blood and or enzymes. If you take a look at the left, it indicates all of these increases in your blood volume and other parts of your blood. As you know, the blood is the carrier of all of the nutrients to the body. So if you have an increased positive balance of your blood, you are able to get all of the foodstuffs that you put in through your body through nutrition to get to your body in a more effective and efficient way. On the other side, creatine kinase is an enzyme that comes out of your muscles when you're training at high intensities for a long time. Essentially, if you have a lot of creatine kinase in your body actually starts to break down and cannot perform at a high level. So in turn, if that creatine kinase is decreased, now your body can perform at a high level again. High performance training plan. Now I'll put this slide on here so you can look at the areas where there's most white. Now what does that mean? The gaps in the competitions is where you would be able to have tapering. Again, tapering is reducing the amount of volume in the training so that the body can super compensate and have another training session and or competition. If you take a look at the middle, you notice how there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 9 to 12 competitions over a 14-week span. Now, that period of time is designed specifically to break the body down. And if you take a look beyond that, again, you can see there's a 3-week gap, there's a 5 or 6 week gap, there's another 7-week gap. Ultimately, all the way to the end, you see those 2 red boxes there at the end. That's when the World Championships were. Now, the reason why I'm pointing out those areas where there's white, because that is the time when you would actually taper and get the body to perform at a higher level for the next tournament. That center area there, much more difficult for the body to peak, and that design there is not for the body to peak. It's designed to, basically overreach the body so that it breaks down, and then you'll see those next 4 mesocycles actually do give the body a chance to recover and then ultimately peak for that final event. That taper design is specifically designed to get the body to perform at a high level at the World Championships. High performance swimming plan, I'm going to scroll back for a second so you can see the similarities there. If you look at the middle section, that's what this section is actually pointing out. It's pointing out the middle section, and it's breaking it down into about a 4-week, 8-week, 5-week, and then 3 weeks. If you look at the first 12 weeks of training, which encompasses April, May, and June, there aren't any competitions at all. So that periodized plan is basically the general endurance phase, and this is a swimming plan, and the specific endurance phase. Both of those are 12 weeks long. Why am I pointing that out? Because it indicates that there isn't any competitions going on there. Again, the whole design behind a high performance training plan is to get the body to train in specific parts of the season at specific times. In this particular form, they're training for 5 weeks, and there's a 3-week taper. Again, they're tapering to give the body a break, essentially, and to peak it. And how you peak the body is by giving it rest. You want to keep the high intensity, but you want to take out the volume. In this case, if you're having a 90-minute practice, maybe 30 minutes of that practice is actually live wrestling. Maybe you would keep the live wrestling there, but you would decrease the amount of technique that you're doing. So you would essentially do a warm-up, cut that teaching in half, cut the drilling in half, and then just focus on the live wrestling. So your practice actually volume would go down, your minutes of training would actually go down, and that's what that taper period is for. Again, this slide here shows, I'm going to scroll back a couple of slides, shows at the bottom again in the middle, and it's indicating the volumes and the intensities. Again, if you look at the first portion of it, general preparation mesocycle, specific preparation mesocycle, the volumes and intensities are actually decreasing and increasing. So if you look at the blue line there, that's the intensity of the training. And if you look at the red line, it starts off with a higher volume in the beginning of the season, and then it actually decreases over the course of the season. Why does that happen? As you go into the competition phase, you're actually getting a lot of your training and or practicing actually in the competition. So you don't need to practice as much because you're going through the actual sport-specific training. Because you are doing that, if the volume stays at a higher level, and this is where a lot of coaches make mistakes again, if you keep the volume practice-wise at a high level while the intensity is increasing because of the competitions, by the end of the season or over the course of a career, the athletes either get burned out and or they'll have flat practices or competitions by the end of the year just because they're fatigued. Different concepts of a taper. 3 or 4 different concepts of a taper here. There's a linear taper, which is going to be better than no taper at all. As you can see, if you take a look at the left there, the normal percent of training is 100% at the top, and then that linear taper is actually decreasing almost in a stair-step fashion, like 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, all the way down to the 14th day. If you look at the exponential taper slow decay, it's decreasing at a much rapider pace than the linear taper. If you take a look at the exponential taper fast decay, that is decreasing at a much faster rate even than the slow decay. And the reason why I point that out is because the volume is decreasing exponentially there. And again, if we decrease the volume, which is the amount of training that you're doing while keeping the intensity high, the athletes actually do get a break. How do you keep the intensity high with less volume? Again, if you're having a 90-minute practice, you would decrease the amount of time during that practice. Take out some of the teaching, take out some of the drilling, keep the intensity high. Let's say you're doing a 30-minute live segment. Instead of doing 30 minutes in a row live, you could do 3 6-minute matches, which would be 18 minutes. Now you're giving them a longer break because a 6-minute match requires a longer break, and that's how you would decrease the volume in a training session. The red line there shows a step taper, which is just reduced training across the board. So let's say on day one, you decreased it by about 60 to 70%. The reason why that is not so effective because the athletes will actually lose some of their fitness if you decrease it for 14 days over that time period. So this slide shows 4 different ways that you can decrease training, and what I feel is the most effective is probably that blue line there. Again, of course, you're going to have to work with each one of your teams, and then you'll be able, depending on the age and or the maturity level, you'll be able to determine that with time. Peaking, tapering, and recovery. Again, you can read through this slide on your own time, but if you focus on the red and the green words there, and I'm going to go through it with you, short-term decrement in performance, that's overreaching, versus overtraining, long-term decrement in performance. Right there you see the short and long-term differences, and if you look at the bottom, restoration may take several days to weeks. Restoration may take several weeks to months. Clearly there is a short and long-term recovery that's actually going on. Overreaching essentially is what happens after every single practice if the coach has a periodized training game plan going on there where it takes several hours for you to recover, maybe a day or two to recover. Overtraining is a longer sort of decrement in performance, which means it may take, several weeks to months, and this is what happens if there is no periodized training, if there is no high-performance training going on. The practices are the same year-round, so I just kind of want to point those out to you so you can see the difference. And you'll see this a lot of times if your teams are having, they start off barn burners and they're winning everything under the sun. By the end of the year, athletes are getting sick, athletes are getting hurt, and that's how you can tell if a team has been overtrained. Effects of intervention of recovery, two or three different concepts here. If you take a look at the red, that's what happens just generally after every single practice. By the next day, they should get back to what some people call homeostasis. And if you've tapered and or given them enough time to recover, athletes have eaten, athletes have gotten enough sleep, there's a super compensation that actually occurs. Again, super compensation means they're, going above and beyond where they were before that practice. In other words, their bodies are recovering higher than they were before because you put them in an adequate training plan. Why the blue and the green lines there are indicating both of them are having super compensation going on. The reason why the blue line is sped up is because they're doing everything right. They're getting enough sleep. They're eating the right diet. They're performing in a tapering type of fashion where the volumes and intensities are changing. Essentially, they're doing all of the recovery modalities that would be prescribed by a high-performance coach. If they don't do all of those things, they're still going to supercompensate. The difference between the red lines and the blue line and the green line is a lot of coaches either don't give enough recovery time or they don't give any recovery time at all, and or they keep the volume of intensity the same, meaning they may do 30 minutes of live wrestling every single day when, of course, that may not necessarily be needed if they're trying to get to high-performance training. Variable duration of a taper. Now this slide is pointed out here to show you that, depending on the sport and depending on the athlete and depending on the maturity, there's going to be individual differences. Of course, there you'll see from 4 days up to 28 days for the taper, depending on the sport. So I want you to certainly look at all of these sports have tapers, and that's what I want you to kind of focus on. If you include a taper in your normal training, you will have high-performance training in the competitions. Do these variables affect peaking? Yes. Most coaches only focus on the training aspect of it, but you got to keep in mind athletes are people, which means they have to go to sleep, which means they are going to have families, and they're going to have stresses with their families and their mom and their dad, or their brothers and sisters. They're going to have, conflicts sometimes with school and or their coaches and teammates. Athletes are going to get sick. Now, why am I saying all that? Because all of these things have to be anticipated by the coach. They have to be weighed and they have to be balanced. In this particular slide, there is no balance, and that's an indication of likely of either the coach not paying attention or the athlete not paying attention. If the athlete and coach are paying attention, then you have high performance training planning, which means the stresses that are indicated in this slide are balanced out by recovery techniques of eating the right foods, getting enough rest in between practices, not having 6 or 7 intense practices in a row without enough recovery. If we're doing all of the recovery stress balance correctly, you have high performance training planning. High performance planning 2. Now this is a form put together by Steve Fraser, who was an Olympic champion and an Olympic champion coach. Olympic champion athlete and Olympic champion coach. What Steve Fraser did was create an athlete planning and review form that I adapted. Essentially what this does is the athlete writes down the goals, top 4 goals, and then you periodically, once a month or so, you review those goals with the athletes, and you talk about what the athlete achieved in the last month, their needs for improvement, and things like technical and tactical goals that they're working on. And how I adapted it was I wanted to focus specifically on psychological needs beyond the technical and tactical goals. What are you saying to yourself when you're out there? What are you saying to yourself in between competitions? What kind of things are going through your mind as you get ready for the match? What is your pre-competition routine? If we can get the athletes to focus on these things and hone in on them before and after practice, before and after competitions, there is a profound effect on the way that they get themselves ready for competition. High performance planning 3. This is another form that Steve Fraser actually put together. Again, he was an Olympic champion athlete and an Olympic champion coach, and he actually won the only Greco-Roman World Team Championship. The USA only has 1 team title. He was the coach that got them there. Again, this is a tracking form. Essentially what the athletes would do here is write down the date, how many hours of sleep they got, what time they awoke, what time they went to bed, what type of diet and nutrition they were putting into their body for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and what type of training activity they had. You may not be able to read that. I just kind of read it for you there, but the idea behind this is the athlete is actually tracking and monitoring all of these indicators every single day, which, of course, have an effect on training. Now they would talk about that in this monthly meeting that you would have to keep the athletes on track to high performance training. And once the coach knows what the athlete's doing, it's a lot easier to get them where they're going. Of course, what I'm suggesting is there's a lot more communication going on if both of those forms are filled out. Long-term high performance plan. Of course, this is what we're all about. This is what this whole slideshow is about. What we do at the Overtime School of Wrestling is identify the talent through an application process. Once we identify the talent, we bring them into the Overtime School of Wrestling, either in the satellite programs or one of the training centers that we have in the north and or in Naperville. What we're trying to do and what we're trying to get our coaches and our athletes to buy into is that first 1 to 3 years, wherever they start, we want them to focus on mastering all of the skills that we're teaching. What happens a lot of times is before the athletes master anything, they start competing 50, 60, 70, 80 times before they even get to high school. And we have to question ourselves as coaches, do athletes need to compete 60, 70, 80 times before they actually get to high school? What happens in most sports, because most parents are so gung-ho and most athletes are so gung-ho across the board, a lot of athletes quit sports because the fun has gone out of it. And what we're trying to do with Overtime School of Wrestling and through the satellites is train them periodically, periodically put them in the tournaments. After they've had 1 to 3 years, now they're ready to compete. And this typically is by middle school. By the time they get to high school, and this is what has happened in some other sports in our country, like tennis, like gymnastics, like track and field, like swimming, these athletes become masters of sport by 17, 18, and 19. It happens all the time in Europe and in other countries, not necessarily in wrestling. Well, I don't even know if we've had a 17-year-old world champion or Olympic champion. In fact, I know we haven't. I know other countries have had that, and I know other sports in the USA have had that. The goal behind showing this slide is if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, we can have masters of sport by 17, 18, and 19. And then, of course, we can have 3 to 5 years of sustained excellence, and they can become super athletes if we follow this game plan. High performance training equals, and you can read that slide just like I can, it's a circular sort of motion there: preparation, observation, evaluation, diagnosis, and intervention. If we are doing this over time, annually, with the athletes' communication, with the coaches' communication, we believe that we can get the athletes to the highest level possible. And if we are doing this and we're doing what we're supposed to do, these things will happen. High Performance Training 2, Peaking and Tapering Acknowledgements. This presentation content was derived from the United States Olympic Committee Training Design Symposiums 2007-2008. Just wanted to acknowledge that every one of these slides was derived from the research that I've done, either through seminars given by the United States Olympic Committee and or as a high performance training athlete, resident athlete at the United States Olympic Training Service in Colorado Springs. And for 8 years I was actually a USA national team coach at the United States Olympic Education Center. If you have any questions on this seminar, please give me an email via sgillespie@overtimewrestling.com, and you can look us up online as well at www.overtimewrestling.com. We can answer any questions that you have. Thank you.